stage, Ray Makala. Now we're going to have a few folks join Ray. In this kind of hybrid panel and case study. Introducing next the Senior Manager of Global Sales Enablement and Leadership Excellence, Christy Jackson from Zoom. Welcome, Christy. Following her, the VP of Sales Training at SBI as well, Mr. Greg Stewart. Welcome, Greg. And please welcome back to the stage, Mr. Ted Lasso, VP of Sales, Mark McWaters.
All right, back to back, Mark. Good to see you back here. Yeah. Well, it's a privilege to be here again. I'm Ray Makala with SBI. Some of you may know us initially as Sales Readiness Group. So I was a partner and CEO of SRG for about 12 years, and we became part of the SBI family July a year ago, and really joined the SBI go-to-market consultancy, the advisory, and the consulting business to be the training and implementation arm of SBI. And we've since acquired a revenue ops company to round out that package. But I only share that because it really speaks to some of the capabilities that we're discussing today. And this topic in particular is one we're extremely passionate about. I've had the opportunity to train thousands of managers over the last dozen years or so. And one of the things we hear pretty consistently, they came into that, we've heard this today, they came into this as high performers, they got promoted, they didn't really have the motion that they needed, the skills and the knowledge to be successful, and they're put into that position as a sink or swim, and they don't have the skills to do that. So we've helped provide that training. What's interesting is we just completed some research that we shared at the Revenue Enablement Society earlier this week on top performing sales organizations, and tried to look at what were they doing differently with respect to sales enablement and training. Not surprising, top performing organizations as measured by growth and quota attainment are leaning in on their managers. They are providing more training, they are investing in their managers, and there was a pretty strong correlation. What was also interesting is that only about 60% of those top performing organizations were actually training their managers every year. And so there's still this big gap, because we hear that it's out there, but maybe they're not closing that gap as quickly as we would like. The reason I want to share that is it sets a backdrop to there's a lot of training out there, there's a lot of manager development we've heard today. What we often get asked then is, okay, so how are you going to measure that success? What do the outcomes look like? How are you really going to see if it's working? And I've had numerous conversations with revenue leaders where they're like, I just don't know. I don't know if the coaching's happening, and what are we getting out of it? So what's unique about what we're going to share today is I think the combined team here was able to put together a solution and really have a unique offering that helps to answer that question, and we're excited to share that with you today. So what we're going to do is tee this up, go back here, and first off, I'd like to just have the panel introduce themselves, if you could, and say a little bit about what your role was on this particular project, and then we'll go into some of the details.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ray. My name is Christy Jackson. Of course, I work for Zoom, one of the senior leaders on our enablement team, and I lead our Leader Excellence vertical at Zoom. And so with this particular project, we were looking for a reputable sales leadership company that could help us close some of the skills gaps within our sales leadership programs. And we so happened to have ambition as well, because we needed a structured and consistent coaching framework to actually apply and reinforce those skills that we learned in our high-impact sales manager program. I've been at Zoom for almost 3 years, and I'm happy to be here.
Greg?
My name is Greg Stewart. I'm VP of Sales Training at SRG, now part of SBI. I've been in sales for 10 years in frontline roles, management, and leadership, and my role in this conversation is I've spent the last 2 years working with with Christy and Stacy and the enablement team. Tammy, I really appreciated your tee up on some of the coaching conversations. But Christy and I spent about a year scoping this out, looking at what are those skill deficiencies and how do we build a cohesive program to fill that gap for managers. And then the last year has looked like, how do we deploy at scale and implement for sustainable behavior change, which is where Mark's going to come in.
Yeah, hi everybody again. My role in the Zoom partnership was the front end. It was like learning about the problem and what the CRO at the time was really interested in driving and why he had chosen with his enablement team the frontline manager as the focal point for how they were going to evolve as a sales org, which we'll talk about here in a second. But kind of unusual for me to sit in a role like this of a case study, but the problem is so important to understand, and I also think it felt like being in a graduate school class of like how you transform a sales org that just went through the wildest uptick that maybe any sales org ever has had, and so yeah, excited to contribute to the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, we're going to pick up there because, Christy, if you could, I'd love to have you kind of outline what problem were you presented with and what were you trying to solve with this combination of training, a platform, consistency across the sales organization?
Sure, thanks, Ray. As Tammy mentioned, the Zoom boom, it was real. How many folks are using Zoom or have used Zoom? Awesome. If you don't, you need to talk to me after this session. But no, I'm just joking. But, you know, we experienced like unprecedented growth. By the end of 2020, I mean, if you look at the year over year, we were up over 300%. With that, growing at that rapid pace, we had to hire at unprecedented rates. You can imagine the chaos and the things that were happening at that time, which was really exciting, of course. But along with that exponential hiring, of course, you had to hire so fast to a lot of folks were just really order taking, right? And so you really couldn't see who was experienced, who wasn't experienced, but of course you have to imagine we had to really upscale or hire a lot of inexperienced managers as well as sellers. So that was the main problem we were trying to solve at that point. So with that problem comes challenges, right? We went from one main core product to a plethora of multiple products so fast. And as you know, Zoom innovates at such fast speeds. And so we wanted to make sure that our CSO and our enablement team had a line of sight into coaching, if it was happening, how the cadence of it, or were we doing it at all at that point. And then another challenge we were facing at that time was it was a lack of structure with regards to the coaching process. So we had managers, and I don't know if any one of you are taking your coaching notes on like Microsoft OneNote or Google Docs, spreadsheet. Everybody was kind of doing their own thing, and there was not a line of visibility into that as well. So we definitely wanted to create a way to kind of see into the rep engagement and also to see the improvement that is happening. And so how did we solve this? So as I mentioned earlier, step one, we wanted to create a structured coaching process. And then, of course, how can we measure the impact of our coaching efforts around that? Again, end-to-end accountability for an adoption for our Zoom way of selling as well. And then, of course, lastly, we wanted to make sure that we set a framework and structure for our frontline leaders to follow.
That's great. Mark, maybe you could comment on how did the problem get presented to you and coming at it from an ambition standpoint. I think it's really interesting to look at kind of the three aspects, right, of solving the same business challenge.
Yeah. So CRO has this initiative called Zoom Way of Selling. Basically, Zoom Way of Selling is we're trying to go from one product to a platform. And I remember in our meeting with the enablement team, they describe how they're trying to go from one product to a platform. And I'm honestly thinking to myself, you all have another product? Like, I didn't know that. And, but I thought, man, everyone feels like me. Like they had such crazy growth that for the CROs in the room, this makes sense. It's like, okay, our user base just went through the roof. I'm less focused on new client acquisition and I'm more focused on how do I expand that user base. And so, but the problem is you got a bunch of green sellers who legitimately, some of the enablement team is in the room today, and I remember one of them telling me that they were submitting orders. There were so many orders. It was just basically like, who can put it through the system? And so if you think about a seller who comes in and that is the baseline, like imagine starting a sales job and the next month, all you're doing is submitting orders. And a few months later, they're having to change your comp because people are making $1 zillion like just inbounding orders, right? So that's why I say I felt like we were in a little bit of this like graduate school case of, man, how do you go grow the user base with more products, but how do you create a system and training for a bunch of people who understandably don't know what that looks like? And when they came to us about the focus on the frontline manager, obviously that's so core to our ethos that I'm like, yes, this is exactly where you focus. Because if you focus on all the reps, you're going to lose. You have to focus on the leader because they will be the force multiplier.
And I think it's such an important point, right? If you're going to scale, you have to start with the managers, and you're going to get that leverage, and then follow on or support the training that's happening. Greg, how did it present from a training standpoint, and where'd you go from there?
Yeah, so there were really two levels to this, the frontline manager level and at the field level. I do have to insert one piece here, just my experience of the Zoom boom. My wife was a kindergarten teacher, and in March of 2020, I helped her get her Zoom account set up to run her classes. I don't think that her kindergartners were the target market for Zoom, but like that was the level of demand Zoom was dealing with at the time. So if we think about fast forward a couple of years, the talent profile is sellers who have been brought in to do just what Mark was saying. They're processing orders. Now there's a much different landscape, and there's more competition. The economic landscape looks different. We've never had to really sell before. So there's this skill gap at the front line. Meanwhile, who are the managers? They were the sellers that got promoted amidst this massive growth period. So we had to look at it from two angles there. And towards Ray's point, the headcount is too large to really make a meaningful impact. Rather than boil the ocean, we really focused on how do we drive meaningful behavior change in their coaching practice.
Yeah, and so one of the things as we were preparing for this is trying to make this real, right? We want to share some real practical takeaways from how this came together and what the different aspects were. So maybe you could just walk us through what that curriculum looked like and a little bit about the training part of the program first.
Sure, so I'll be brief. We don't need to do a whole product demo here, but in essence, what you're seeing on the screen here is our perspective on the core functions of a frontline sales manager as it pertains to driving sales productivity. Certainly there's other things that a manager does in terms of forecasting and leading up and all of the behind the scenes things that they do, but when it comes to building a team, managing their performance, driving productivity, there are 5 pillars here, but I'll just shorten it to say this is about a 3-day workshop where we looked at, part 1, how do we think like a coach and develop a consistent framework for driving coaching conversations with our team? How do we hold the team accountable to their performance expectations as we build pipeline? Tammy was talking about their forecast calls on Thursdays, roll up to Colby on Fridays, and then Mondays. What are we doing to make sure that we have quality input for those conversations? Someone earlier had talked about create a vision board, and you better have clarity around that and hold your team accountable to that vision. So as a leader, and then what does that talent profile look like? Do we know we have the right team on board, and how do we know that?
Yeah, it's great, and we'll talk about the rollout of that as well, but I think what was really fascinating is this was happening in parallel to the Ambition launch, and at some point, I think brilliant minds, right, at Zoom said, well, wait a minute, these things are so interrelated and so tied together, and in fact, we can leverage this, and that's where the magic happens. So Greg, can you just quickly talk us through, a rollout? I think we just wanted to share a little bit of the magnitude of what this looked like and a little bit of the tools that were included.
Sure. So macro point here is this was not a small endeavor. If managers are a force multiplier in your organization, invest in them accordingly. We've spent 12 months here deploying this to over 200 managers, so nearly every frontline manager across Zoom now has a common language and set of tools for how we design or how we build a coaching plan with each frontline contributor across the organization. Second point I want to make on here is nearly a third of this timeline was really on customizing the program and properly communicating the change. So the first group that we trained, I can't see super closely there, but the third bullet there, the first group that we trained was senior leaders, like Tammy and Colby and all the direct reports. So there's 20, 30 people that manage 500 plus reps across the organization. They were the first people to go through this program, to give feedback, to really make sure this was relevant to their team. And from that core curriculum, as we went around the globe, we continued refining so that at every region, for every role, there's relevance. We can't expect a frontline manager to translate some general concept into their team. We have to draw those connections for them. So all they have to do is take it and go execute.
Yeah, great tee up, and it included actually delivery with translators and workbooks in Japanese, which I thought was actually a really nice addition, and they said it was one of the best things they've gone through. So really, really great lift there. So just talk briefly about the tools, because then we want to go to, talk about how this came to life and ambition. So can you just talk about this toolkit a little bit, Greg?
Sure. So this is really focused on just the coaching element of the program. As we've been discussing, that was a key priority. How do we drive skill development at an individualized level? So in short, we look at how does a manager work with a seller to be collaborative and to collectively create a plan where we know where are we strong, where are we weak, to build a plan together. And that third piece, I won't go into real detail on each of the thumbnails here, but how can we work with each member of our team so that there is a jointly created, rep-owned plan that's targeted for their development?
You want to add to that, Christy?
Yeah, so basically, if you see what's on the screen here, this is actually part of the manager toolkit. We were so invested in this program, we created a whole seismic page that's called High Impact Sales Manager Program. So it has all the materials from the training to help reinforce. We have the on-demand videos there. We have the capstone projects, which I thought was a great part of the program because it wasn't just, oh, here's the program, you go home. It was like, and you're in college, right? You have to now apply what you've learned over the last 3 days. So you're not getting away scot-free. But that's another way we reinforce the tools that they have here. We wanted to make it easy for them to grab those tools, and we have all of these in a dedicated page to our High Impact Sales Manager program within Seismic.
Okay, so we got the training piece, we got the business problem. Now we want to transition to, well, how do we know what's going on relative to coaching? If we assume, okay, they have some fundamental skills, they're able to do that, they've adopted the coaching mindset, they have some tools they're using, but let's look at what that looked like. And Christy, I think this was really interesting where you really tied it to the Zoom values and some of the big drivers you were looking at. Can you walk us through what you were measuring here?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an example, a sneak peek of our template. And as you can see at the top, we wanted to make sure that each time the manager logged in or the rep logged into their weekly coaching, they knew what was expected of them. So for example, we have this 10-6-3 framework where it's 10 meetings per week expectations, 6 high value activities, and of course 3 times the pipeline. And also the questions we work with, if you look at the sample questions here, they basically came out of, well, they aligned them to our core values of care. That's our main, one of our main core values. You know, we care for our customers, our team, our businesses, our community. And so we try to infuse care with these questions because these are humans that we are dealing with. They're not just a number.
That's great. And so having that, I think the sneak peek and understanding what a good one-on-one looks like, and then went into really thinking about that accountability. And obviously there's a lot of detail here. But Mark, do you want to talk through, how you brought this to life and kind of how the platform came into play here?
Yeah, so Colby Nish, who's their North American head of sales, I hope I'm not butchering his title, but his step one was, I want to make sure a one-on-one happens every week, and I want it to be on these same 5 questions, which is a very elementary but smart way to get started. You are building the motion, and now there's a clear expectation that it's happening. What ambition brought to that was a level of accountability and visibility for enablement and for leadership like Tammy and Colby to see if the coaching conversations were actually happening. It's one thing to mandate it and have a calendar invite, but it's another thing to have proof that these questions were coached on and this check-in in their case was completed. So what you're looking at is a report that shows what their completion rate is. And this was such a priority that the CEO still to this day, Eric, is on a call with the leadership team where they read out check-in completion percentage. So it is part of the cadence, the expectation from the sales team. And if you're not green, if your team isn't complete, then you are being asked why. So while there's something to be said for kind of the bottom-up approach or the top-down approach, in this case, at this scale, it had to be top-down. It had to be, this is important to the org, here's the clear expectation of what will happen, and here's step one to help us get there.
That's great. So with that, then implementing some of the specific tools and enabling the manager's toolkit. Christy, can you talk about how this was enabled in the platform and what's going on with the heat map here?
With the heat map, love it. So with Zoom, it's important, even as an enablement professional, we show the ROI. We know things that doesn't get used gets taken away, and we didn't want that to happen. So if you look on the left-hand side, that's an example of SRG's or SBI sales skill profile assessment, to where the rep is measuring their proficiency from a level of 1 to 5 on proficiency and motivation, level 1 through 5. And so once the rep completes their grading, and then the manager now has to score as well, once that process was completed, we basically transitioned that information into our own dashboard. So we took it a step further. We put the information into our own ambition dashboard that we created, and so you can see the green, of course, there was no issue there from what the rep graded him or herself or versus what the manager saw. If it was red, that's alarming. That may be a gap there, right? And so this is the heat map where you can see red, that's a gap there, and then of course green, the better they were in alignment.
Yeah, and again, I would say, having seen hundreds of implementations of different ways of going about sales coaching, to be able to capture that information organizational-wide at scale, and then be able to equate it to, hey, what are going on in terms of skill gaps? Where do we have commonalities? Where do we need to lean in? What should be on the next agenda for a skill builder session, or maybe a follow-on training? Now we can see that, and also, and I think it's part of this collaborative coaching idea, we have the reps bought in, because it wasn't something that was top-down done to them, but they had a stake in it, and so they helped to own the outcome. And even in the case where they disagreed, hey, we have a way to have a conversation about that and open up and now figure out why there's a gap in what expectations are or why we aren't seeing it the same way. So I think it creates a very nice discussion for the manager and the rep, and then also a way to visualize it across the organization. Greg, Mark, anything you'd add to this in terms of seeing it all together?
Yeah, I would like to add just a couple comments. So when you look at this, there's a few different ways this could be positioned. So Tammy talked about on the last panel, skill-based cohort groups. If there's a group with a common deficiency, we're working on it together. So tying that together with this heat map, that cohort is not based on just someone's opinion. It's based on the data here, which has rep input. I think there's a risk if I'm a rep and I'm now being told you're being put in the discovery, like remedial cohort or something, I'm not going to be super happy about that. I could see that becoming kind of an engagement or a cultural issue. But this is based on rep input with one-on-one conversations with their manager. There's joint buy-in there. So everyone's coming into a cohort to work together on something they've agreed they want to improve on. So it's both for targeted coaching between manager and seller, and it provides insight at a higher level for more targeted training.
That's great. Okay, so the last piece that we'll share, and then we'll pause for some metrics and key takeaways, but again, wanted to show actual detail coming out of the platform, but this is another area that for me is brilliant because it now allows us to tie specific activities to those areas we've identified for an individual. Christy, can you just at a high level characterize what this is?
Sure. So if you go back to the heat maps, for example, if you saw something in red, for example, if they were red on prospecting, then you could click on there was a left-hand sidebar that had, if you scroll down, you could find prospecting. So once you clicked on prospecting, it now created a leadership path or a skill gap path for you to coach that rep to help close that gap, if that makes sense. So we pulled these classes from Masterclass, and they all align. Whether we use Masterclass, LinkedIn, depending on which skill you clicked on, it could take you to LinkedIn, Masterclass, but basically there were some coaching tools and resources to help you close that skill gap. We didn't just want to say, oh, you read. No, you're red, but let's see what we can prescribe for you to help close that gap, if that makes sense.
It's amazing. And for those of you who have been in learning and development or sales enablement for a while, how long have we been talking about training at the point of need, right? And in the flow of work and in making that accessible. And now you can actually see where that's needed and what resources are available or work with your manager on that.
Absolutely.
Mark, do you want to just comment from an ambition standpoint, how you pulled this together?
Yeah, and to shout out, I should not be up here like taking some kind of victory lap. Like Scott Cook, who's our customer success manager for Zoom, I don't know where Scott, he's in the back. So Scott really makes a lot of this happen for the team. And to give you like a tactical example of that, so we meet with Colby. As a partner, we're just like, hey, Colby, how can we continue to support you? Like, what's the important thing you're driving right now? We want to be his initiative driver, whatever the initiative is. And he's like, well, we're doing this training with SRG, and I really want that tracked and have the follow-up inside of Ambition. Can you do that? And we're like, hell yeah, we can do that. So Scott goes in and builds out templates with their team of the takeaways from the different training classes. And now Colby and Tammy and others have this inspection layer of, okay, they're meeting weekly. They're talking about the training they just did with SRG. We can see it's happened. There are different ratings that can be given inside the coaching conversation to give another lens of more qualitative feedback inside the session. But the reason the partnership works so well together is that we have this foundation where the coaching conversation is happening on a regular basis. So whatever the initiative is, Colby knows he can just go put it inside of Ambition, and now all of his frontline managers are going to coach to it every week. Well, they go in and have these great training sessions and big takeaways, but those managers then go back to the fire drill of their job the next day, right? We've all kind of heard about these examples. Well, their framework now living inside of Ambition creates this consistency, you got to hear something 7 times or whatever it is for it to really resonate. And now like the two together are creating sustainable change at Zoom. So, to give, while it's fun to, of course, give like SRG and Ambition some nods here, it really is Christy and Scott and Colby and Tammy like with the vision of how this would work best. And I hope that's a little more of the lens of why I think it's been successful. Chrissy, would you add anything to that?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I give Scott all the credit because he is probably one of the best CSMs I've ever seen in my life. But absolutely.
That's great. Well, so we're going to kind of wrap things up here. And, this is the reveal slide. But again, looking at a lot of programs like this, we don't have these metrics often. Right? Or if it is, it's made up, and then we don't get back to it for another 6 months when somebody says, hey, how are we doing on that? And we have to pull it together. But being able to really lean in on these metrics, and Christy, maybe you could just characterize kind of what was important to you all, and then how this information came together.
Absolutely. So if you look at the screen, you'll see to date. So these metrics were pulled year to date for Zoom. We've had over 30,000 check-ins. That is amazing, where we wouldn't have had line of sight into this if we didn't have Ambition. I thought this was amazing. And then also, if you look over, we had over 3,000 next steps or action items, which we don't even know if that was happening prior to bringing on Ambition, right? So we have line of visibility into seeing like next steps, action notes, and things of that nature. And then also, if you looked at the last metric here, the 76%, that's the average completion rate that we have. Depending on, which is a global number, but if you look in geo, some geos are 80-something%, 70, of course we want 100%, but in my book, 75% I think is great. Anything over 70% is great.
It's really strong.
Absolutely. And I hear Zoom has one of the highest usage rates of any company, so I'm very proud that we're really using the platform. And then at the bottom, these stats just go back to our SRG skills profile assessment that you saw earlier with the heat map and, you know, the grading from the AE versus what the manager thought, them being graded on that particular skill. So we had over 29 groups complete the SRG skills profile assessment, which was amazing. Over 217 managers completed it. And then we had a 79% rate of completion rate with the SRG skills assessment, which is important because it shows that we are reinforcing the concepts, the tools that were taught within SRG. So that's one of the reasons I really love Ambition, because it allows us to maximize our training programs and see a return on our investment.
So if I could add one other quick thing, which is going to be really exciting for Zoom, but I would, implore those that don't have this to think about this. So right now in the AI craze, there's somebody in your company who's like, yeah, but we can't trust our AI because our data isn't right. Like that conversation's happening a lot. Yeah. Well, for Zoom, they have 33,000 coaching conversations that we're going through their process where, every company now, if a vendor like us is adding AI, you got to go through all these approvals to make sure everything's legit. So we're doing that right now with Zoom. Once that is approved, our AI is now going to be able to read 33,000 historical coaching conversations by the individual and manager to make the right suggestion for the next coaching conversation. And so the point I wanted to make is, yes, obsess about your data and, lead the AI in the right direction, but are you obsessing about coaching data? Zoom has been, and I think they're going to see a huge boon from once this starts to feed the frontline manager.
It's outstanding. Well, I know we only have a few minutes left. Greg, what's a key takeaway, a lesson learned, something you would share about this program and working together with Zoom and Ambition?
Yeah, thanks, Ray. So we talked about building a consistent framework for coaching across the globe. And that's super important, but I think for me, it was sort of this visceral understanding of how important it is to make it relevant to each audience, whether we're talking about AEs versus CSMs or SE roles. Those managers need to know that the content works for them. So taking the time by role and by geo to appropriately tailor like the exercises, the activities that we're doing, the toolkit that you saw, that's unified. Anyone that's using these tools in Ambition, it's the same. But to get like true buy-in and execution on this across the globe, we took a lot of time with EMEA and with APAC to really make sure it was culturally appropriate and relevant to the challenges that they were dealing with. So that was one of my favorite things that I learned throughout that, was just that like heart knowledge of why it matters to make it appropriate for each group.
Outstanding. Christy, I know there were a lot of lessons learned, right? And we're still learning them, but what would you share with the audience as a takeaway?
I would say in order for any of your programs to work, you need leadership buy-in, top down. And one of the things that you heard earlier, and Tammy will attest to that, before I even rolled this out on a global level, the senior executive leadership went through it first. So they were completely bought in. They were already utilizing the tools and templates before we even got back to our homes. And so if you can get the buy-in from your leadership and show the value and the business justification for it, bring them along the ride, you'll always have success with your programs.
It's outstanding. Anything you'd add, Mark?
Just grateful to Zoom and you all for the partnership, and obviously we're thrilled with the results. Stock price is doing great right now. It's obviously all because of us, and no, I appreciate the presentation.
Love that. Well, I'll just close with one other thought, which is, and I was a little bit on the outside as this was evolving, and I was hearing about this, and there were so many times where I'm like, well, wait a minute, we can do that? like we can actually operationalize that and we can make it work, and then the ambition team would come back and say, yeah, how about this? You know, what is this? And so to see it come to life was exciting. The other thing, and we've had a lot of discussions about this, is if you could imagine having this kind of data and now correlating it to sales performance data, so pulling that in, right? And again, you're not seeing that because literally we're finishing the training. But as we start to look at pipeline growth, you said lead response rate was something you're tracking, right? Now we can see, is coaching making a difference? And those teams that have higher completion rates and more coaching are actually outperforming. And
Yeah, and I'll add to that. And what Ray's referring to, we looked at like impact metrics from Q1 prior to from the first cohort taking the program until after that, and we saw a 57% reduction rate in untouched leads, which was amazing. So something's working. I think it's ambition along with SRG's program that's really impacting those results.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you very much for your time.